modeling in the context of national malaria strategic planning and global fund applications. This is co-hosted by the SMC Alliance M&E subgroup and AMNet. So we have Erin Eckert co-hosting here with me today. This webinar is going to have 7 presenters. We're going to open with a presentation of the overall process of subnational targeting and the context for modeling with a focus on SMC. Then we'll have 4 presentations from individual modeling groups that have supported this process. These groups will talk about the assumptions and approaches that go into their SMC models. Then we'll have an example from the Nigeria NMEP illustrating their SMC targeting approach and how modeling informed their discussions. And then finally, we'll finish with a presentation from Global Fund talking about how decisions on SMC have been made in Global Fund funding requests. So a reminder to everyone that this session is recorded. So if you missed something, you will have an opportunity to review that later. Every presentation should be 15 minutes. So as presenters get to the 15-minute mark, Erin or I will remind you that it's time to finish up quickly if you aren't finished yet. We will take any clarifying questions at the end of each of the 15 minutes, but we will save any discussion questions for the end of the webinar. There'll be an opportunity to have a discussion at that point. You are welcome to put your question in the Q&A box in either English or French, both are okay. If your question is for a particular presenter, please go ahead and indicate which presenter it's for. And don't hesitate to put questions in as they come up. And if they are discussion questions, we will simply save them for the end. All right, and with that, let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is Dr. Beatriz Galatas. She's an epidemiologist working for the Strategic Information and Response Unit of the Global Malaria Program at WHO. She is currently the focal point at GMP for the support provided by WHO to NMCPs on subnational tailoring of malaria interventions to inform the malaria strategic planning, funding requests and implementation, monitoring and evaluation. In this role, she's provided support for subnational tailoring to over 30 malaria endemic countries over the last 4 years. She's also the focal person for the burden estimates of the World Malaria Report. Bea, go ahead, you can start when you are ready. And you are still muted, so go ahead and unmute.
I'm so sorry. Thanks, everyone. Good to see so many people here. I'm going to start straight away because I have many slides and I only have 15 minutes. So I was requested to provide an overview of SNT, the subnational tailoring approach, and specifically what has been done to support countries who wanted to inform their SMC strategies particularly. So before I start, I want to say that I'll be presenting a lot of maps as examples from different countries. Please do not overinterpret these maps outside of this presentation. They're purely for explanatory purposes. So when we say SNT, we essentially mean the use of local data and contextual information to make decisions. Those decisions pertain to specific questions within the cycle of a national strategic plan, whether it is at the strategic level where we want to ask where should we intervene and what interventions should be placed, versus when we're posed with the funding limitations and the questions become what interventions can we afford and what should be prioritized, versus at the implementation stage where the questions are more aligned on when or how should we intervene and what is the most efficacious strategy, for example. So these are all questions that SNT can be used for. And most importantly, it is not just focused on the analysis, but also on the consensus building process that this process follows, engaging the local partners, funders, etc., with the leadership clearly from the NMCPs. I'll go now through some definitions that we use in this process. The first one that you've probably all heard a lot is the definition of stratification, which essentially is the process of creating maps or geographically and temporally classifying different indicators that will be used to make decisions, whether those are malaria risk maps or other determinants that help make decisions depends on the question. And now there are various methodologies that can be used to create these maps. And that's the process that we use for stratification that then informs the intervention mixes that will be implemented in a specific unit of analysis. Whether the intervention mixes that result from the stratification process are optimal, meaning agnostic of resources and therefore aligned with the strategy, or whether these mixes are more aligned with the prioritized plan in the context of very limited resources when very hard decisions need to be made, or whether this stratification is aligned with the quality, or meaning the implementation planning of the interventions. So we have already the stratification, which is the use of various layers of information. We bring them together, we make decisions according to the strategy or eligibility of interventions, the priority of these interventions, or how we can plan these interventions. All of this is linked. We then have impact projections, which is done through mathematical modeling, as it's the only tool we have to predict the future in an appropriate way. And this is used to evaluate the different options from which we arrived using the stratification approach. They themselves do not say where the intervention mixes go, but they help inform the impact of these choices and therefore define the decisions at the end. So now moving particularly to the context of seasonal malaria chemoprevention, which, as you all know, is the intermittent administration of curative doses of anti-malarial medicines during the malaria season. And the purpose is to clear existing infections and prevent new ones during the period of the highest risk. Now, what we've done at WHO is that we've taken the recommendations from WHO and we've broken down the exact recommendations from WHO into different criteria that could be informed by specific data points or specific indicators. In this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the first three, which are we should implement SMC in areas of seasonal malaria transmission, which defines the where, the location, during the peak of malaria transmission season, which defines the when, the period of time when this will be done, to children of specific age groups of high risk, so that informs the who. The other two questions relate to the type of antimalarials and how the burden will be reduced, and I won't get into those because we're talking more about the targeting. So I'm quickly going to start with the where, right? So the first thing that we know is that it's SMC is recommended in areas of seasonal malaria transmission with moderate or high endemicity. So there's two things that are happening here. On the one hand, we have to define transmission seasonality in all areas. That's the first criteria. In order to define transmission seasonality, we really need to look at two things of the peak: the duration and the amplitude of the peak. And I will get into that in a second. But you can have potential seasonal areas that have very low transmission. And the other criteria is that we should target SMC in areas of significant transmission. The main reason behind this is because if SMC is planned to be given in children, it is mainly the children who should have malaria. You should mainly have children in areas of historically moderate and high levels of transmission, where the adult population has some level of acquired immunity through time, and therefore it is not the population of highest risk of malaria. So how we inform moderate and high levels of transmission? This depends per country. Majority of countries use more than 5% prevalence for SMC specific purposes. Other countries may want to use incidence, and they may want to choose areas with more than 100 cases per 1,000. This changes through time, so I won't get into the specific thresholds that each country would use to define moderate to high transmission, but this is the very step of the process. Now, what I will focus on is the aspect of measuring seasonality. And there's two questions that appear when asking ourselves whether an area is of seasonality or has a sufficient seasonality that is appropriate for SMC or not. The first question is the type of data that we're going to use to make this analysis. And the second is how we're going to define seasonality. So in terms of the type of data, as you know, ideally, we should be using routine case data. as the main source to inform transmission of cases, or sorry, the seasonality of cases. However, we're all aware of the various limitations that routine case data has for this particular use, particularly involving the impact of case management practices and access to care practices, but also, most importantly, the impact of SMC itself and other interventions that happen at the beginning of the rainy season that affect the peak. And therefore, the routine data is in itself biased for this type of analysis. It is this reason why most cases in Africa, we tend to use rainfall data instead to get a better sense of the seasonality patterns, as rainfall is normally the most approximate factor, the stronger factor that leads to or that triggers seasonality. You can see here differences for the same seasonality method. If we use the case data versus if we use the rainfall data, the results for SMC seasonality are very different for Ghana. Now, how seasonal is seasonal? And in the WHO practical guide, we recommend that more than 60% of the cases need to fall within a period of 4 months or less. And if cases or routine data is not deemed appropriate, then the same should be applied for rainfall. That is very easily said, but not so easily implemented when we think about how many periods of 4 months do we have within a time series. So the way we've tried to resolve this problematic has been through the development of an algorithm that's actually quite simple and still evaluates or applies clearly the criteria from WHO, where for every 4 months of a time series constantly, we're evaluating whether for those exact 4 months, the rainfall or the cases observed exceed the same value observed for the same 12 months. And we do that for all the 4-month combinations of a time series until the very end, which allows us in the end to identify peaks of transmission or combinations of these 4-month windows that have more of 60% of the cases or rainfall happening within the same time. Now, the question is, for example, on the left, you can see the results from Guinea, where we've used this algorithm for a substantial period of time, and we've identified the areas in orange as the areas that have continuous seasonality, so continuous peaks observed through an extended time series. However, if we're using rainfall, it's not always the case that rainfall is the primary trigger of seasonality. And in any country, and I give the specific example of Guinea, but there's others, once we've identified the areas that are seasonal according to rainfall, we then need to do an extra level of checking where we make sure that the trends in cases are actually aligned with the trends in rainfall. And if they're not, why is that? And there is nearly in all countries situations where there's actually additional and most important ecological factors that are driving the case seasonality patterns, where, for example, in the areas with agricultural or irrigation schemes, you'd probably have very seasonal rainfall, but not such seasonal case patterns. And that should also be taken into consideration because these areas should not receive SMC in spite of the fact that they have rainfall, very seasonal rainfall. So now moving on to the question of when, the main questions that countries also have is how long is the duration of seasonality and when does the peak happen? Essentially there's a few things that we look at. The first one is within the areas that we've identified that are seasonal according to rainfall cases or other factors or both. We want to first identify the lag between rainfall and cases. We also want to identify the best timing of implementation. We also want to know the duration. And that all aligns into a more specific implementation plan. So going back to the example of Guinea, where we have the areas in orange that are identified as seasonal, we have identified, we've measured the peak duration in the different districts, and we've translated that into the number of rounds of SMC that would be required, and essentially, given the duration of the peak in nearly all areas of Guinea, 5 cycles would probably be better than 4 in all the yellow areas. Now, the question is, when do you add the 5th cycle if you were to expand the 5th cycle in the areas where you've already done 4? The first question is, when do you have the most amount of cases? What is the 4-month window when you have the most amount of cases? And in Guinea, it was clear that the highest peak happened between July and October. So then the question is, when do we add a 5th cycle? Is it better to add it in June, or is it better to add it in November? And by looking at the additional number of cases that occur either in June or in November, you get an idea of when you would avert more cases, or when you would prevent more cases. And that, in the case of Guinea, showed that it was in November. Here, I'm just showing you examples of how we respond to specific questions. There's various other ways in which we responded to this question differently in different countries and different settings. Lastly, I will talk briefly about the WHO, particularly on the age targeting. And to inform on the age groups, the most important part is to look at severe malaria admissions and who is most affected by severe malaria. Now, as we all know, severe malaria data is very unreliable in the majority of countries, so we end up having to use uncomplicated malaria as a proxy to understand severe malaria admission patterns. And then also the definition of the target age group, considering that in most cases, we have under 5 and over 5 case data reported, but not always do we have 5 to 10 year-old case reported. So that's another layer of difficulty that prevents us currently from having a very good idea of how to target age groups for SMC. Now, the reality is that this question mainly arises in countries where SMC is already being done in under 5s. And the question is, when do we switch from the under 5s to the over 5s, or when do we expand to the over 5s? And this is not an easy answer. And as I've said, the data is not of sufficient reliability at the moment in nearly any country to make these decisions purely based on severe malaria admissions. So there's a few things that we need to consider. First of all, if you're doing SMC in under 5s, you first need to know how far, in terms of reduction of the percentage of cases that you're seeing in under 5s, do you need to go before you consider expanding to other age groups? Meaning, how sure are you of your effectiveness of your SMC? The second is how much of a problem do you have in your 5 to 10-year-olds in terms of severe malaria? The third one is whether this is operationally feasible and whether this is cost effective. All of these questions are quite complex, and this is an area where maybe mathematical modeling in an exploratory way could help identify specific thresholds. And now I'm almost done, yes. So I'm just showing you an example of Burkina, where you can see clearly what I was talking about. Under 5 cases are decreasing, and under and over 5 cases are increasing. This is a mirror image of each other, but still is showing us that maybe this is a situation when this has to happen. So I'll just finish with the example of SNT for SMC, particularly in Togo, where the first question of where to intervene was answered with a map of incidents, a map of historical implementation of SMC, and an analysis of seasonality. 4 additional districts that were not doing SMC were identified as potential SMC targets. Then a duration and the timing of the duration of the peak and the timing of the peak were investigated to plan for this SMC. Now, mathematical modeling came at the end to investigate to predict the additional impact that adding SMC into these 4 new areas would have. And this was interesting to them because it would inform their global fund funding request specifically. So I'll finish with this slide. In terms of the lessons learned from this exercise, as you've seen, there's various questions that happen when we're talking about SMC SNT, subnational tailoring, whether that's the eligibility of where should SMC be implemented. That's different from how should SMC be implemented, where we're thinking about the number of rounds or the timing, versus if we were to prioritize or scale back SMC, where would we do it? And ideally, we would start with the areas that where their scale back, where the prioritization will lead to the least harm. The WHO recommendations, as you see, are kind of flexible and they can be adapted to each country in terms of the seasonality definitions and the thresholds for risk. It is very important, as you've seen, not to confuse the overall SNT process with the role that modeling has. And mathematical modeling, which you will hear for the rest of this session, is very important, but has a very specific role in the whole process. And as you've seen, another key limitation for SMC decision-making particularly is the data quality and availability. And therefore, things like national data repositories, reviews of your surveillance system so that they collect the key information will be very key to address all of this. So thank you very much. Sorry for exceeding my time a little bit. Over to you.
Thank you, Bea. So I see that there's been some difficulties with the French interpretation. Erin, do you want to give a little walkthrough for those who might have some problems? But it seems it could also be a connection issue or a tablet issue.
Yeah, I am not 100% sure what the issue is. When I do it, I hear it fine, and that's what the IT group is saying. But some people have told us that you have to click on the language that you want and then click on terminate above. I'm not sure what that is. Maybe it's the mute original button.
For me, I just click the French and it works perfectly, but we will also share the French version of the recordings. So if interpretation was not working for you at this time, then you will still have access to the recording in French, and hopefully that will be working perfectly. So then let's just go ahead and move on. Then.
Wait, very quickly, can I just say it in French really quickly? Pour ceux qui ont besoin de l'interprétation, veuillez cliquer sur l'icône en bas, interprétation, et puis choisir la langue qui vous convient, soit anglais, français. Et normalement, ça doit changer directement dans l'autre langue. Pour certains, peut-être il faut cliquer sur Mute Original Audio, ou terminer l'audio original pour avoir la traduction. J'espère que ça peut marcher pour vous. Merci.
And sorry for all of these issues that people are experiencing. All right, next we'll move on to Caitlin Beaver. She leads the malaria modeling team at the Institute for Disease Modeling within the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Her team uses simulation and data analysis to support decision-making that accelerates progress and reduces disease burden on the road to eradication. Through partnerships within the foundation, as well as with external researchers, operational teams, and policymakers, they assess new ways to get more out of existing anti-malarial tools and design the characteristics that will make new technology effective in the future. So I will share Caitlin's slides on her behalf due to her machine not working very well with Zoom. So let me go ahead and get that started. Share, please. And Caitlin, I think should be working now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. And I am going to stay off video just in case, because my computer is has such a strong distaste for Zoom. So next slide. So as Jolene mentioned at the outset, we have a series of 4 talks from modelers, and me being the first of those talks, I have been tasked with describing the value of modeling for understanding SMC impact in the most generic terms. I know we have quite a diverse audience today, so let's make sure that we're all on the same page about what we are talking about when we refer to a model. and in particular, what we're talking about in terms of the models that we're applying to the question of SMC impact. So the models that you're going to see today are ways of abstracting the real world into math. You can take that math and then you program it into a computer, and that then serves as a tool for exploring the ways that the real system you're modeling could work. So in a way, it's almost like setting up a virtual laboratory where the experiments are computer simulations. Next slide. So those of you who are already experienced with models will know that there are in fact many different kinds that range from simple to complex. For malaria modeling specifically, we tend towards the complex side of things and employ what we call mechanistic models. And by that, I mean a model that tries to capture the mechanisms of relationships between different measures, as opposed to just statistical relationships like correlations. So essentially, these mechanistic models that we build account for why and how different quantities influence each other, and in particular, how they influence each other as a function of time. Next slide. So this is especially useful for very complex systems, such as malaria epidemiology, where different quantities can influence each other in nonlinear ways and also over vastly different timescales. So for example, an anti-malarial drug, such as you might use for SMC, may take action within a few hours, but intra-host immunity that develops when a person is exposed to malaria may last much longer. So we required this level of complexity so that we can use the models to answer complex questions about the various factors that impact malaria burden. So this image here is sort of representative of the kinds of things that are typically included in a malaria model, and they will not all contain exactly the same details, but many will try to capture the key features of malaria epidemiology, such as the vectors, vector to human transmission, and intrahost biology, which may include the parasite dynamics as well as immunity and symptoms. And you will hear more about the specifics in Pete Winskill's talk. Next slide. So what makes this kind of modeling so valuable for understanding malaria, and even more specifically for understanding seasonal malaria chemoprevention? So as I mentioned, one element is that the models allow us to play with time. By that, I mean that we can use them to try to understand the past and also to project what we think might happen in the future. So in the specific case of SMC, we could, for example, use a model to estimate the impact of a past SMC campaign. In a randomized control trial, we can estimate impact by comparing the intervention control groups. But in a programmatic setting, we likely won't have a control group against which to make a comparison. The model gives us a way to theoretically add or subtract an intervention and thereby explore counterfactual scenarios. And another commonly used application, which you'll see a lot of today, is using these models to project how many cases would be averted with a future SMC campaign in a place that has never received the intervention. Next slide. So models also allow us to be very specific about place. Countries may differ in important ways that influence the potential impact of SMC, which Bea already covered a little bit, such as seasonality and transmission intensity. And the models that we're using allow us to specify the characteristics of different environments and populations so that we can tailor our questions about SMC impact to a given area of interest. And of course, given the recent changes in WHO guidance, which makes room for greater flexibility in how countries choose to implement their chemoprevention, there's a broader set of areas that may opt for programmatic SMC. And modeling is a fantastic way to test how malaria will respond in these different places, and thereby to help us decide if SMC is a cost-effective choice compared to other interventions. Next slide. So as we discussed earlier, malaria epidemiology is incredibly complex. There's just far too much detail to keep in one's head, and simple statistical models are usually insufficient for capturing the interactions across components. Not only do we have to worry about how SMC impact might interact with age and prior exposure, but we also have to think about past and concurrent interventions. Because the models allow us to describe these interactions mechanistically, they do the hard work of integrating all those effects and interventions for us. And finally, next slide. SMC is also an operationally complex intervention, and the mechanistic models enable us to test operational choices and outcomes like coverage achieved, number of doses per year, or the age limits of eligibility. Next slide. So to get all of these amazing benefits and be able to address these complex questions, there's a lot of work that needs to go into developing an appropriate model. So if we were going to say, ask questions about the value of SMC in Nigeria, we might start with a conceptual framework for a model, which, as described earlier, sort of identifies the key components and how those relate to each other. Next slide. But then we need to go through a process of calibrating the model so that it produces base epidemiological behaviors that we know to be true. The data that we use for this process may not necessarily be from the site that we're interested in simulating the scenarios for, but we make use of the best data that we have. So this could include data sets from studies or trials that give us information about how clinical incidence or prevalence may change as a function of age and exposure. Next slide. Once we have that baseline behavior developed, then we want to parameterize specific interventions that we care about, in this case, SMC. Again, here we typically use study or trial data to do this. And then finally, next slide, please. We need to take into consideration the specific site that we're modeling to characterize, again, these things like seasonality and transmission intensity, so that the questions that we ask of our model are specifically tailored to the region of interest. Next slide, please. So it's not until we have all of those pieces, back one. Until we have all of those pieces that we're able to address the practical questions. And this can be quite a lot of effort and detail to be able to get to this step. Next slide, please. So one thing that we're interested in covering with you before we get into more of the modeling detail is just what can and can't be addressed. So one thing that we often discuss a lot with our partners is the distinction between model inputs and model outputs. So we put a lot of detail into the model to be able to produce outputs, but it can't tell us everything about the system. So one example is that the model isn't necessarily the right tool to be able to predict future SMC coverage. What it does is it takes our estimate of what we think future SMC coverage might be, and then translates that into the impact on malaria burden. Another important thing for everyone to know is that, of course, no model can perfectly predict the future. All models have uncertainty and limitations. And there are great reasons for this. We don't know all the details of malaria biology. The trial and study data sets that we use to calibrate the models have uncertainty themselves. And where we have to integrate routine surveillance data, that often has even stronger biases and uncertainties than the trial study sets. And these are things that we have to try and account for. For you non-modelers in the audience, I would say that when you're working with modelers, you absolutely should ask questions about all of these things. And for the modelers in the audience, we should all be prepared to speak to the uncertainties and to pay attention to these things and to be able to explain them well to diverse audiences. So all that said, I do want to land on the issue, or this last piece about models just being a very powerful tool for exploring realistic application of interventions like SMC. So, creating a model isn't easy. it is a lot of work, but that said, it is much cheaper, faster, and easier than conducting a randomized control trial. And models also allow you to explore a large number of dimensions at once, whereas a control trial could look at maybe one or two. And by being able to look at all these different concerns, that helps you to make better decisions across these different characteristics that you care about. So I will now pass it to Pete to go into more detail and specifics.
All right, thank you, Caitlin. I think I did not see any major clarifying questions, just discussion questions. So we'll move on to Pete. Pete Winskill is a research fellow. Every time someone shares screen, I lose my script. I'm funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, working at the MRC Center for Global Infectious Disease Analysis. He leads a project to develop a global malaria modeling framework using the Imperial College London malaria simulation, malaria transmission model. Pete's focus lies at the intersection of infectious disease modeling, software development, and policy. His work aims to support global modeling requests and national or subnational malaria modeling efforts, contributing to effective strategies in disease control. All right, go ahead, Pete.
Thanks, Janine. And yeah, thanks to all the organizers for putting this on. It's an exciting schedule. And yeah, it's great to see so many people have joined. So I feel like I should just start by with a few quick acknowledgements, as most of the work I'm presenting today hasn't been work by me, it's been hard work of others. So a big thank you to Hayley Thompson, Lucia Kell, Gina Cuomo-Dannenberg, and Patrick Walker, as well as Azra and the rest of the team here at Imperial, Hannah and Amir from PATH, Matt Kens at SHTM. And of course, I think I speak for all the modelers here to say that no modeling would be possible without an incredible amount of hard work by staff and the participation of people in the many trials and implementation programs that we use to build our models and parameterize them accurately. So a big thank you across the board. So I'll just briefly go over how broadly our model is structured at Imperial College, and this is analogous to the examples that Caitlin just presented. So we can broadly split the model into three key components. The first one being the environment, and that a key feature there is rainfall, and we'll talk a bit more about rainfall seasonality further on in the presentation. Then obviously we have to have a mosquito component and the malaria within the mosquito. And then finally, of course, malaria in humans, and this includes lots of what are actually quite complex dynamics around immunity and symptoms and other biology within the humans and the parasite interactions with that. And so we can kind of think about how we might pin those different sections of the model together and how that relates to seasonality. And I've got a kind of a schematic here to demonstrate some of the key elements in the model and how they vary with seasonality. So we can start with the blue curve on the left-hand side here, which is our rainfall over time. So we have rainfall that's very seasonal in this schematic. That drives, after a short lag, mosquito density in our model, so the number of mosquitoes. We're assuming here that more rainfall will lead to more mosquito breeding sites and then therefore more mosquitoes. Again, after another lag in the model, we have the yellow curve, which is the entomological inoculation rate. So this is mosquitoes that are infectious to people, and that therefore drives clinical incidence in the red curve. So we can see as we move from blue to green to yellow to red, we see this translation of how seasonality in rainfall gets translated out to seasonality in the human population and the epidemiological outputs. And the final curve there in purple there is just infection prevalence, which kind of gets smoothed out and smudged over that time period. And that's kind of how we see seasonality progress through our model. And of course, we have to layer on top of that the different interventions, and they can target different parts of this model. So for the environment, we might have larval source management. We have the key vector control interventions against the mosquito, and then a selection of human targeted interventions, including treatment and vaccine, and other chemotherapeutic interventions, with obviously SMC being the focus of today's talks. And so the question is, how do we ensure that when we're modeling those interventions, we're capturing their impact correctly? And on this slide, I'll just overview a general approach to how we think about approaching that problem. And then in the next few slides, I'll try and kind of color in some of the details with respect to SMC as an example. So I've split the general approach down into 3 sections here: fit, validate, and simulate. So the first of those is where we try and fit our model to the best available data that we can find, using the appropriate statistical techniques to estimate the parameters of interest. So these might be parameters related to the efficacy or the duration of our intervention, and we want to fit those to the best, most unbiased data that is available. After we've gone through that fitting stage, we then want to validate the model and its estimates of impact of that intervention against other data sets. We want to challenge how generalizable our findings from the first stage are, because eventually we hope to be able to model this intervention over a wide range of different settings. And that's section 3 here. So once we're happy with steps 1 and 2, we can then use the model to simulate the impact of this intervention for specific settings, but we can importantly include settings that are not in that original fitting data. So to think about SMC specifically, when we are setting up the model, I think it's intuitive that the first thing we need to be confident about is the seasonality in the model and how that translates, as I showed in the schematic before, from rainfall through to cases in humans. So to do that in our model, Imperial, we take a rainfall data set. So this is the CHIRPS data set, which is a collection of both satellite estimated and direct observations from rain gauges. And we can extract the data for a given location from those estimates. We use a software package called Umbrella, and that allows us to produce smoothed rainfall profiles like this one on the right. So the black points are the rainfall data there, and the red is our seasonal profile, which gives us an idea of where the peak rainfall is throughout the season and the duration of that rainy season. And Matt Cairns a little while ago did some work to validate how seasonality is tracking through the model from rainfall through to cases. And he did that by collecting some data from studies that showed clinical cases of malaria in seasonal sites. He then represented those sites within the model, including the rainfall seasonality, and used the model to predict the cases over time throughout the year. And then he compared some metrics of the model predictions against the observation data. So the plot on the left here is just a metric capturing the overall seasonality, and the plot on the right is just another way you can measure seasonality, which is the clustering of clinical episodes, how tightly packed they are together. And Matt Cairns' work here showed that the model was doing a good job about taking rainfall data as an input and producing patterns of clinical incidents that were representative of what we were observing in the actual data. So the next step, specific for SMC, once we are happy with how seasonality is being modeled, is capturing the impact of the drug. And importantly for SMC, that includes the prophylactic protection over time following the drug being given. So this is work from Hayley Thompson, and she used data from an SMC trial in Burkina Faso and fitted the model to those data. So we can see in the left-hand plot, we've got the control group and the SMC group over time, and the model fits are in the colored line and shaded areas, and the black line is showing the data from the trial. So we were able to nicely capture what we were observing in that clinical trial. And we can use that fit to translate across into the right-hand plot. And the right-hand plot is just showing how the protective efficacy of SpAQ falls off over time following the dose. So this is capturing how how the prophylaxis starts off very high after you've just been given the drug and then begins to wane over some period of time. And you can see how that would be important for capturing the specific impact of different timings of rounds of SMC. And so this kind of constitutes the fitting stage that I mentioned before. So the next stage is to then validate our model to make sure that we're happy that these findings from this study can be more generalizable. So, so the kind of question we're trying to answer here is, how well can our fitted drug profile capture observed trial data from other trials? So Hayley worked to identify SMC trials in the literature and then simulate those trials in our model. And she did that by matching a lot of things as inputs to the model. So she matched the intensity of transmission, the seasonality, the coverage of other interventions, the vector species, and importantly, the nuances of SMC delivery during that trial. So that could be variation in the number of cycles, the age ranges, the timing of delivery, the coverage. So she kind of captured all those things in the model and then used the model to kind of independently estimate what we think efficacy should be in those trials. And we can then compare it to the observed output from those trials. And this kind of provides a comparison of how well our model is doing against the gold standard trial data. And it allows us to have confidence that we can generalize our modeling results for SMC in this case to a wider range of settings. So the map I'm just showing here is identifying the locations of 8 trials in 5 different countries that Hayley's literature review found, and that were included in the validation. And then the plot here is summarizing the validation. So the trial results, as reported in the papers, are shown by the black points and the uncertainty bars. And then model estimates with some model uncertainty are shown in the blue triangles. And we can see that over a range of different trials, we see different efficacies, but our model was able to capture those different efficacies based on the model predictions and the other inputs that went into the model. So in nearly all of these settings, the model estimates are close to the point estimate and certainly within the uncertainty range of the trial estimates. So this is a really, really nice result that gives us confidence that we can generalize our model findings more broadly. So I just thought it would be helpful to include this slide on effectiveness here, because I'm sure there are many of you in the audience today who may have posed the question to a modeler, a very reasonable question: what's the effect size of SMC in your model? And you may have received the rather unsatisfactory response where we kind of wave our hands and we say, oh, it depends, and I think it's important to try and kind of just step through that and show some reasons why we're saying we're not being able to give a very specific effect size. And so I think these points are obvious, but it's important to reiterate them just to say that obviously trial efficacy isn't the same as real world effectiveness. The way a trial is implemented is not the same as the way SMC is operationally implemented. And as a result, the modeled effect size in one setting doesn't equal the modeled effect size in another. And it's this point, which is why it can be difficult to give a very specific effect size for an intervention in a model. And one of the reasons for that is that the models are very flexible, and there are lots of other aspects of the model that we can specify that are going to act as modifiers on the effect size of SMC for a scenario that we model. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but just some important ones that came to mind were we can change the coverage, the frequency and the number of SMC rounds, the timing of rounds relative to the seasonal peak, the age range that the SMC is being targeted to, the properties of the drug, how people receive multiple rounds, whether it's the same children each time or different children each time, and also all of the other interventions. And changing one or many of these inputs will modify the impact that SMC has in the model for that given scenario. And the plot on the right here just shows some outputs from the model for SMC, RTSS, and combinations of interventions. So this just goes to show that the complexity in the model can be really useful, because it can allow us to be very specific about how we model SMC and hopefully capture the specifics of the impact of SMC in a given context. And finally, I just wanted to include a quick example of how the imperial model has been used to help in the HPHI or SNT process. And this is an example from Mali, where Hannah and Amir did some modeling to help address some questions from the PNLP there. And the example here is just a question about whether subnationally targeting the number of SMC rounds would be an efficient approach. So the models allow us to specify and change the different number of SMC rounds. So we could run one scenario where all places eligible for SMC receive 4 rounds, and a second scenario where the number of rounds is more closely tailored to the specific seasonality in that setting. And this is just an example here, but this strategy showed that the targeted dose approach, where either 2, 3, 4, or 5 rounds were given, did outperform the strategy. So it had a greater impact than the approach where everywhere received 4 rounds, but it did require more doses overall. So in this case, that little additional piece of evidence went into the much broader decision-making process that Bayer talked about, and the PNLP in Mali in this case decided to proceed with the 4 doses across the country. And yeah, just to say that if people are interested in looking a little bit more about the software, then it's all openly available at these links, which will be shared at the end of the talks. And that's all for me. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Pete. Erin, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jelaine. I'm going to be introducing our next speaker as we move into the next set of talks. And just as a reminder, people are putting excellent questions in the chat. Please continue to do so. We are monitoring.
If you want to write a question in French, we can translate it afterwards as well. So please be free to type your questions in your language.
And with that, I will introduce our next speaker, who is Christian Sellinger, a mathematician by trade and working in infectious disease modeling for more than 10 years. He is particularly keen to understand how within host heterogeneities impact disease dynamics at the population level. He's been working mainly on pathogens and diseases affecting humans, such as HIV, influenza, polio, HPV, coronaviruses, and of course, malaria. When he is not sitting in front of his computer screen in Basel, he enjoys traveling to Africa for work in order to get an idea of the disease context. So, Christian, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Sorry for this lengthy introduction. It actually cost me 1 minute of my talk. Can you hear me? Is everything all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay, so I'm even more moving into country-specific modeling, so following a bit Peter's talk. So it will be about model-based evaluation of the potential EPI impact, introducing SMC in Northern Côte d'Ivoire. Okay, so yeah, here. So the first question is, how can modeling inform a policy? And I think here we already stressed this several times. So malaria transmission models, they capture the essential mechanisms of disease dynamics. And when calibrated to country level data, can answer specific operational questions asked by the NMCP. And I think it's more like gearing a discussion. I think that's the main role of modeling here. And for SMC, I think the question that we got from the NMCP/PNLP was basically, as Côte d'Ivoire is a country that has not had SMC before. So the question was first, which health district should we start SMC? The second was, we know our seasonality patterns, we know our like rainy seasons, but is there a specific time of the season that should start the SMC? And the third one, and I think that's the one we cannot really give an answer now, but it's also really important for modeling, already mentioned by Caitlin, is what would be a realistic coverage for SMC given a real world like constraint setting. I just recall this nice figure by Matthew Cairns about SMC and the old idea of SMC eligibility, I think, which has been now widened a little bit. So what you can see here on the left-hand side is on the x-axis, the maximum cumulative rainfall in 3 months. On the y-axis, the percent of incidence in peak form in the 4 months here. And you can see here on the right upper corner, this is basically the space where things are happening in the very seasonal pattern. And you can see here, those are basically the ones that are in orange up to red, those regions. And if you look carefully to the map, you can see here in the Sahel region, they have been already eligible for SMC over time, historically. But now, as you see, for example, Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire are really close. So Cote d'Ivoire was always kind of the brink of this. And I think they're really interested for this next funding cycle to look into the question of SMC. The precipitation patterns in Cote d'Ivoire, and especially in the northern part of the country, they are at least partially fulfilling those criteria and quite seasonal. So here you can see the precipitation share in the different regions here, and the red contour here is really what we consider northern Cote d'Ivoire. So especially the region in Savane is the one that is of interest here. The other one is here about what do we do with SMC in our model. So I think you have seen by Pete those already those figures. Here in OpenMalaria, you also have different choices. So OpenMalaria is the agent-based model that we use here. This is DPH. We consider that SMC is given to an individual at a full regimen for those 3 days, SP plus AQ, third day. We have the clearance of parasite in blood during 25 days. This is our main assumption. And if you look at the pharmacodynamics of chemoprevention, this plot here, you can see that you are basically have the parasite killing for about 28 days, 25 days. This is our assumption. And in the model, there are many different features in the model, but we consider this just a step function. So you say, if you give SMC to an individual in the model for 25 days, you will have no parasitemia, and then you will go up again. What is also important in discussion with modeling and here for SMC is, as Bea mentioned, the process of SNT. And I think this is owing to her, those figures here from WHO. We're working together with the NMCP in Cote d'Ivoire to look at which health regions and which health districts would be eligible for SMC. And you can see here on the orange map, this covers largely what we called Northern Cote d'Ivoire. And there's a refined analysis by Bea, which actually even suggests the number of cycles. But again, at the operational level, since this is the first time that the NMCP would apply here SMC, there wasn't the question about the number of cycles, more a question about, we go for 4 cycles, where should we start, which district should we pick? The seasonality assumptions here are at the regional level in this model, in this version. So you can see here, basically between, say, July, August, September, October, the largest share of the precipitation for those 3 northern regions. The green one is that we are interested in the Savannah region. So this is basically where the rainy season is. And in our model, we assume this relationship between the rainfall and then the EIR, so the entomological inoculation rate, with a shift about of 1 month, also like in accordance with the figures that Pete showed. Another important thing for country modeling is the intervention and intervention coverage. In Cote d'Ivoire, we only have long-lasting insecticide-treated nets, and we have some districts with IRS, and of course we have case management. Those are the 3 elements. And as you can see here, those are map estimates. They are not very specific to the district level granularity, even for the regional level. And we have also tried to use DHIS2, so routine data, but the quality issues mentioned already before by Bea, maybe let us stop this, and we rather rely here on map data for a moment. Important for modeling is, of course, model calibrations, the fitting procedure. Here it's more about fitting to so map data, simulated prevalence here. You can see it in green from the model, and the dots are the ones, the black ones. We always try also to counter check with DHS data in 2016. You can see here we're rather a little bit underestimating prevalence with the model. The only parameter that we are moving here, that we are inferring, is the transmission intensity over an entire year, what we call the annual entomological inoculation rate, which is basically just rescaling, meaning it's basically telling you the seasonality pattern is following the rainfall, but then you will see what's the area under the curve that changes kind of. And we also have parameter uncertainty in there, which just means that we have the uncertainty that we have in the observed prevalence. We can relate this to what we would infer as the uncertainty in our rescaling, so this intensity parameter. Okay, so luckily, SMC is not at all uncharted territory for Côte d'Ivoire. So in 2022, there was a pilot study in Dikodougou. You can see here, Dikodougou is a health district south of a bigger city, Korogo, in the Savannah region. And I think it was communicated at ASTMH last year by Kangla et al. It's a poster session that 76% versus 23% was the malaria detection here in kids under 5 after 3 rounds in the, of course, the no SMC versus the SMC arm. So a 70% decrease in the prevalence. Now we are more into the business of validation. So we have our assumptions, our model assumptions about 25 days of parasitemia suppression. Now we would like to validate. Now, as I was doing, I was recalibrating the model now at the health district level and just looking into what happens if you would apply SMC. And in the future, and this would mean here for Côte d'Ivoire in the next year, so next August, for example, August till November. And you can see here before we are about a 37% prevalence in under 5s, and we would end up after 3 rounds here at 40% here. And this is also owing a bit to the ITNs that we're using here, and it would decrease to only 9% prevalence. We're about a 77% decrease in under 5 prevalence after 3 rounds. So we are in the ballpark of what has been observed in the pilot study. Now at the national level, I think the first question always with NMCPs is what is the impact at the national level? And here we are using our 25 days of parasitemia suppression, and we are basically looking into the future starting in 24. And here we look into the months that are covered with SMC. And since the NMCP was already going for 4 months by their definition, the question was here rather just, should we start in August to November? Should we start in July until October? And you can see here, if you targeted the right month, you could save, you could gain another 4,600 cases averted, severe cases averted. The same holds for additional percent cases averted in the under 5. So again, you could gain here 2% additional cases averted if you would start in August instead of starting in July. And this is also very much in line with what the NMCP was thinking before. So if modeling can kind of validate also the intuition of people in the field, that's always reassuring. Now, the other question was really here about which health district should we start with first. And I'm plotting here on the left-hand side what I call risk reduction. So it's basically here the severe cases averted per 1,000 population under 5 in the years to be evaluated. So from 23 to 28. And you can see here this colored map and those lighter districts. I've also plotted the labels here. Those are the ones where you would pick first if you were to reduce the risk of severe malaria in under 5s. And you can see, of course, Dikodougou is in there, Korogo, the biggest city in the north, is in there, and a couple of districts that are actually rather south. So they're not really into the classical seasonality regions that we have seen before following the rainfall. But those are the recommendations that we would give here with 4 cycles. And again, I mentioned here is 80% coverage in under 5s. So this is, of course, assuming a hypothetical coverage. I think the next point of discussion will be, of course, are there any agricultural activities during the season and so on, other factors that can prevent this kind of coverage assumption. And the second one, I think that's the most important one, is the burden. So here you can see the lighter, the more severe cases averted. So Korogo 1 is a big urban area in this seasonal part of the country, and you can see here your yeah, you're quite averting like tens of thousands of severe cases in under 5s. So you would rather pick Poku-Awuku if you want to go for the burden reduction, and other regions like Segela and Mankono, which were also in the risk reduction. Yeah, with this being said, there are obvious limitations to the models. It's very important. So here, our intervention seasonality data is really only at the regional level, although we're calibrating to health district level. The uncertainty, I didn't show this here, but the uncertainty prevalence used for calibration is really big, because the more you would zoom in, the more you would capture uncertainty, because the geospatial estimates that we use, they very often they don't have data from specific sites if you zoom in. And that's the third one is really that the operational coverage is unknown, but likely too optimistic in the simulated scenarios. Yeah, as a conclusion, I would say SMC effectiveness in Moponaris is about 77% reduction in prevalence in accordance with the pilot study. We still need to dig a bit deeper in the conditions surrounding the pilot study. We had quite a high prevalence in the beginning. The burden reduction is about 39% of population at risk if we extend it to the entire eligible areas. It's a national one. And we can help optimizing by aligning, basically doing the right, starting the right month in August. And the prioritization should be given to health districts in the Savannah region, if you look at this northern area, which is also in accordance with the PNLP. So with this, I thank my team here. So Emily Pottin is the team lead of the analytics and the intervention modeling team at Swiss DPH, and my colleagues. Lots of collaborators from Cote d'Ivoire, from WHO, also Malaria Consortium. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Christian, for an excellent presentation and some really interesting visualizations of how that works, how the models work at a country level. Again, a reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A, and we will come back to these questions during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'd like to turn to our next presenter, who is Ben To, a postdoctoral researcher at the Northwestern University Malaria Modeling Team. He's broadly interested in using mathematical and statistical models to understand ecological problems and infectious disease dynamics. He has been using eMod to model malaria transmission for the past 2 years, supporting a number of countries in their strategic planning process. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ben. I think you're still on mute if you're speaking.
Okay. Sorry.
No, thank you.
I completely forget that I'm muted. Thank you. Thank you for the introductions. And thank you for listening in. I will be presenting today some examples of how we predict the impact of SMC scenarios using eMod, which is the model that we use here in Northwestern universities and also in IBM. All right, where's the next? All right, so we work with a number of countries, and we often receive the kind of questions that we receive on SMC usually can be categorized into sort of 3 groups. And I'm going to use 2 examples today to sort of cover these 3 types of SMC questions. So given all other interventions, what are the effects of SMC if you were to expand it to new areas? So we'll be using Guinea here as an example. They are interested in expanding SMC to the 3 new areas here. Next type of questions, what are the effects of having an additional cycle of SMC? Another type of questions, what about, extending the SMC eligibility to older children? So we'll conveniently use Burkina Faso as an example, where they've identified 5 districts here that is actually eligible for 5 cycles instead of 4 cycles, the usual ones. And they are also eligible for age extension. And we'll look at some of the scenarios and some of the predicted impact. So before I show you the results, I want to walk you through with some of the things that we do to our model to make sure that our results are credible. EMOD is an agent-based model. It models climates and its relationship with mosquito habitats. It models vector to human transmission and human back to vectors kind of transmissions. And it also accounts for within host parasite dynamics. Now, having a model is not enough, really. We want to make sure that our model output is valid, is realistic, and 3 factors need to be accounted for here. First of all, we want to be able to capture the age incidence relationship that we've seen in the field. So if you look at, for example, 2 sites here in, I think, Senegal, if you look at the incidence age kind of relationship, you can see that the cases are always concentrated in younger children. And that is kind of like the reason why SMC is used to target this age group, right? And we want to make sure that our model also produce this kind of relationship, and we adjust the immunity parameters. And you can see that the blue color line now goes quite close to the red color line. All right, next step, we want to make sure that the SMC protection in our model is correct, such that it can reproduce the kind of trial results. We use predominantly the infection prevention mechanisms. When you take the SMC drugs, you clear out the existing parasites that is inside your bloodstream, and you would gain protection from new infection. So kind of like the drawings here, you start out with a very strong effects, and then it wanes over time. So we would adjust the protection effect strengths, the protection decay time to match with the field data, specifically the effectiveness that we've seen against clinical incidents in the trial. So we use a specific trial published back in 2015. And down here, you can see the efficacies from the weeks since the last cycle. It kind of wanes over time. And on the right-hand side, you can see the cumulative hazards, again, taken from the study from the week since the first SMC. So you have SPAQ down here, as expected, control up here. So then we would sort of adjust the parameters to get these solid lines as close to the dots as possible. So in this case, parameters seems to be too strong. In this case, the protection seems to be weaker than what we wanted. And this would be something that is optimal. And once we are happy with these sets of parameters, we want to understand how the SMC protection behaves with these parameters. We test it on specific scenarios, 4 cycles of SMC, 100% coverage in an area where seasonal transmission is pretty high. So we look at the incidence output, and you can see that at this point, once we give our SMC, the incidence drop almost down to 0, and then it comes back up as the protection effect wanes. And then you give out another cycle of SMC, it comes back down again, up, down, up. By the end of the SMC campaign, you can see that the incidence comes back to the level that is similar to without SMC. So as we expected, we are happy with this, and we move on to the next stage, which is to capture the kind of local level malaria transmission as accurately as possible. To do so, we model each individual health district separately. So in Guinea, in this example, you have 34 districts, you have 34 models. For each of the districts or model, we want to first capture the existing interventions. This would mean schedules and also coverage as accurate as possible. Next, we want to make sure that the seasonality in our model measures those that we've seen from the routine case data. So here is an example district. you are looking at the scaled confirmed cases from this January to December. And so when you reach number 1, it means that you reach the maximum number of cases here. So our job here is to adjust the sort of monthly transmission strength such that we get a profile that is very similar to that of the routine data. Finally, we're ready to try to match the transmission intensity for each district. So we use prevalence and incidence as guidance here. On the left-hand side, we have DHS data that provides us the prevalence of children under 5. Here's an example of the district. So 3 dots here. And on the right-hand side, you have incidence for children under 5. These 3 dots would be adjusted from the routine case data. Specifically, we want to account for testing rates, reporting rate, and treatment seeking rate. So we have all these so-called reference data, and we run a bunch of simulations, each with different values of baseline transmission intensity. And we pick the lines that is and the dots that is close to these reference data as close as possible. And we use those values for the next stage. Which is to say, once we're done with accounting for all these 3 factors, we are ready for future projections, and we want to answer some questions. Now, remember, back in Guinea, we are interested in evaluating the case averted when we were to expand the SMC to additional districts. Now, you're looking at the results for the 3 districts here, and we start out with looking at without SMC. And on the top panel, you can look at the incidence from 2020 down to 2027. On the bottom panel, you have incidence that is aggregated for the 3 age groups of interest here. Okay, so you can see that the numbers fluctuate up and down over the years, and that's because we also account for distributions of bed nets, which is done at once every 3 years, and the effects wane over time. Okay, so with SMC, you can see that lots and lots of cases are averted here. And you can also see from here, specifically for under 5 children. Interestingly, you would see that there's also a little bit of drop in 5 to 10 years old. And that's really because we assume that once you implement SMC in a new district, some of the SMC drug will inevitably go to these age group children. All right, we also calculated sort of the total number of cases averted over the period of time that the countries are interested in, and we would report these numbers together with the plots that you see here to the countries. Okay, in Burkina Faso, I remember that we are interested in first the impact of additional cycle of SMC and or expanding SMC to older age group. Again, we start out with looking at the results for 4 cycles targeting under 5 children. Next, we look at what happened when we add an additional cycle. You can see that there's a small gain in children under 5 here. What if we stick to 4 cycles, but we extend the eligibility all the way down to 10 years old? And you can see that as we expect, 5 to 10 stand to gain the most here. And finally, intuitively, if you were to do both policies together, you would avert the most cases. Obviously, then the question is, how much resources do you have to do both policies together, or do you need to prioritize one over the others? And this would produce some kind of guidelines for the country. All right, so those are the 2 examples that I want to show you. Before close out, I want to discuss some of the challenge that is associated with this kind of SMC work. I think the biggest one is the uncertainty in SMC coverage. Depending on who you ask, you can have more than 100% sort of coverage according to demand and supply kind of data. You can have, on the other end, down to like 20 or 30% coverage based on some clinical trials that happen to collect this information. It's a very wide range of possible coverage here, and it really affects our ability to make assumptions for not necessarily just the existing area, existing SMC area, but also in those future SMC area. And this is particularly challenging when we want to produce results that make sense for countries. Next up, modeling seasonality is really difficult. If you think about it, the relationship between rainfall and malaria transmission is complicated. Probably you have rainfall that affects mosquito habitats, which affect mosquito abundance, and then affecting malaria transmission. It's a chain of relationship here. And as Bea has shown us just now, you can see that analyzing the seasonality in the rainfall is not the same as analyzing the seasonality in the routine case data. That is all to say that using climate alone often is really difficult to describe the kind of variations that we see in routine case data. This is even harder if routine case data is limited or of low quality. But yet, it really is very important that we get the seasonality in our model right? Because we are talking about SMC. The correct time window to give out SMC would be affected by the kind of model seasonalities we have. And I think there's really a lot of room for improvements here in the models and in modeling the seasonality. Finally, more and more countries now asking the questions, should we extend SMC to older children? And I must emphasize here that a lot of our works are based on the assumption that SMC effects in older children is the same as under 5. It need not be. It needs to be well studied and updated as and when these data comes in. With all that uncertainties and challenges in mind, I want to emphasize here that the model exercise that I've shown you all just now is still very important here. It produced the kind of trends and relative effects of interventions that we should be focusing on when it comes to decision making. And as more and better data are collected, we think that models will be updated, should be updated and improved, and producing a better model output for guidance. So with that, I would like to thank everyone on these slides who has contributed a lot to all the works that I have shown you just now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that interesting presentation. I know I'm personally very much enjoying seeing how this modeling can be applied to answer different questions in different country contexts. And I hope we'll get into deeper discussion on that when we get to the Q&A session. However, we have a couple more presentations and want to move quickly to the next one. Our next presenter is Cyril Ademou. He is currently the Monitoring and Evaluation Manager on the Global Fund Malaria Grant and Head of Surveillance and Data Management within the Surveillance, M&E, and Operations Research Branch of the National Malaria Elimination Program in Nigeria. I'm going to turn it over to him to present his work. Great, take it away.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead and start.
Okay, good day, everyone. My name is Cyril Ademou, as the panelists had introduced me, and I'm making this presentation on behalf of the Nigerian National Malaria Elimination Program. And quickly, we'll be showing you how we're able to use data to inform the context of scaling up the seasonal malaria chemo prevention. And just like in form of background, we would look at the historical overview of where the country was implementing SMC before we did that analysis and had to scale up, as well as some of the intervention criteria we use which inform the scaling up of SMC, some of the challenges we observed along the way, as well as the current update on SMC implementation in Nigeria. As an introduction, the National Malaria Elimination Program and its partners in country adopted implementation of seasonal malaria chemo prevention in 2014. This was in line with the recommendation from WHO in 2022 and 2012 that countries that are within the eligibility criteria are free enough to commence implementation of SMC. And in implementing this SMC, what were the key factors we considered? We considered climatic and demographic characteristics, and the areas targeted for implementation of SMC took into account those areas that had more than 60% of annual rainfall occurring in more than 4 months consecutively for that period. And for the 2022 SMC implementation, it was done in 21 states, in line with the results from the subnational tailoring that the country did in collaboration with Global Malaria Program, the WHO country office, and other technical partners. And at the moment, this SMC is implemented across one state, and each state have its own peculiarity. And these peculiarities are put into consideration whenever plans are underway to implement SMC yearly. Then just to show us the historical overview of the seasonal malaria chemo prevention implementation in Nigeria, we could see just 1 or 2 points. In 2014, we're implementing SMC, and we could see a gradual scale up of this implementation from 2014 to 2019 before the subnational tailoring stratification analysis was done for the country. And what informed this stratification as well as the SMC scale up? I know if we remember looking at the meeting that I held in Mozambique in 2018, where most of the countries were off track in meeting the global technical strategy. The high burden to high impact approach of the global community was formed. And as part of that, next step was for countries to do a stratification exercise. And Nigeria took that opportunity to do this analysis, and it considered data along the epidemiological line. We also look at data taking into context the data from the routine surveillance. We also considered data from the entomological area, and specifically for SMC, we also took into context WHO criteria for targeting of SMC in a high burden to high impact environment. Then before this analysis was done, we considered key parameters as it relates to SMC. We looked at areas that had parasite prevalence of greater than 5%, and also areas where we had consistent rainfall of over 60%, and in which this rainfall occurred more than 4 months consecutively for the rest of the year. And also in doing this targeting of intervention and stratification analysis, we also looked at how feasible it would be to implement the SMC. And also we also had to further prioritize the implementation of SMC as it were back then due to available resources. And in doing this analysis, we had to consider available data. We looked at malaria parasite prevalence data that was available for 2000, and also that was available from the Demographic and Health Survey for 2018. And based on realistic estimates, the country decided to go with the 2018 DHS malaria parasite prevalence data. And again, another key criteria in targeting SMC or analyzing results that would inform where SMC should be deployed was also seasonality pattern, which I had mentioned earlier. So in combining this seasonality pattern across the country and also prevalence, the country was able to arrive at areas that are eligible for SMC, formed part of what was used to inform the National Malaria Strategic Plan of 2020. On the screen, I would see all of the areas that are eligible for the implementation for SMC, taking into account the seasonality I mentioned earlier, and then the malaria parasite prevalence. So at the end of the analysis, we were able to prioritize local government areas across states in line with the feasibility to implement this SMC. And just to also say that the purple component you're seeing was only applicable when we're doing the funding request for the NFM3. That is no longer applicable for the Global Fund Grant Cycle 7 that the country just got approval for from the Global Fund. So when we did the stratification analysis, we saw that all of these LGAs in purple were eligible for SMC. And again, those in purple were also eligible, but again, we also had to consider available resources. And what the country did was to take these areas that are in purple to the prioritize above allocation request of the Global Fund and NFM3 funding request. And I had also mentioned this. This is just the same as what we had showed earlier. Then just a bit of the final analysis, what it showed by the different areas in the country, what each LGA or state is due to implement. As you can see, all of the areas in the country are due to implement the malaria case management and IPTP for pregnant women attending ANC. We could also see that all of the areas in the country are also due for ITN, though the type of ITN also varies for CCB, PBO. I could also see those who are meant to implement urban LLN, while we also have some components of the country eligible to implement SMC and IPTI. Then to enable us to address some of the concerns we had, considering resource availability and then feasibility to implement, we recall my earlier slide where some of the areas in the country were in purple because of available resources. We had to introduce the concept of modeling at this point. When we did the initial prioritization, it was based on available data, routine analysis, and also in-country discussion to prioritize where SMC will be deployed amidst the scarce resources. So to enable us to convince the Global Fund that yes, it is very critical to implement SMC across all the eligible parts of the country, and particularly in the 10 of the 13 states where the were supporting the country to implement malaria control intervention. We had to engage with the Northwestern University and IDM to model the impact of SMC and also implementation without impact of SMC in those PAR states, which are Gombe, Kwara, Kaduna, and Niger. And just also flag that in 10 of the states that are eligible for SMC implementation, then we had to prioritize based on previous experience implementing SMC, and that was how we're able to arrive at this for who haven't implemented SMC in the past. So what we did was we had posed a very key evaluation question that, assuming we go ahead to not implement SMC in these 4 states, what will be the impact in terms of life saved? Looking at the parasite prevalence and malaria incidence in children under 5. And assuming we are able to convince the Global Fund enough and resources are available, we implement SMC in these 4 states, what will be the overall impact in terms of malaria parasite prevalence and also under 5 incidence? So that was when this evaluation modeling had to come into contest. And as we can see for Gombe, the model took into contest if we had to implement 80% effective coverage of all core intervention from the NSP. It also considered assuming we, based on current and available implementation in the country, if we had to increase the NSP implementation by 10% from the current baseline as it were when this evaluation was done. And if we were to increase the NSP by 20%, looking at the current implementation as it were from then, and also if we were also to increase the NSP then from the baseline by 30%. And the key one of interest took into contest those the funded scenario of the Global Fund NFM3, where we had seen that 10 states of the 13 Global Fund supported states were eligible for SMC implementation. And 4 of these 10 states had to be kept in the prioritized above allocation request because of limited available resources. So in the modeling was able to answer if we were to increase, if we were to include SMC in this power LGS, which is red on the screen. You could see the impact it would be in terms of reduction in burden in under 5, as well as in malaria incidents across the 4 states we had prioritized to be within the power.
Sorry, just letting you know you have 2 minutes left, please.
Okay. And just also say that the summary, I had also presented some results of the different scenarios and the impact it would bring when the Global Fund eventually decided to fund the implementation. And some of the key use of the subnational tailoring analysis was that we used it to finalize the 2021 to 2025 strategic plan. And then we also were able to expand the implementation of SMC to 10 states from the initial 6, looking at the evaluation analysis that was done. And it also informed commencement of SMC in other states that had never implemented SMC. And based on current scope in the country, we can see the gradual increase from about 4 states and 19 LG in 2015 to over 400 LGs across 21 states in 2022. This is just to demonstrate that the subnational tailoring that was done has actually had a great impact. And this map shows current implementation arrangement. For now, we are implementing 2 approaches. Some states implement 4 cycle, while some other states implement 5 cycle per round. And in implementing this 5 cycle, the country also had to look back to Global Fund WHO recommendation again to see what it says, particularly in areas where you have more rainfall and also more burden, which are beyond the 4 months and consecutive cycle, and particularly that most of the states we had identified to fit into this criteria are all within environment where you have more than 4 months rainfall.
And
So,
Cyril, we need to wrap this up so that we can move to the next presentation and still have time for questions.
Less than 30 seconds, I'll be done. This is just a micro plan for the 2021 SMC implementation by partners, which is currently being implemented in the country. Then just to also show progress in terms of treatments given in the country from 2015 to 2022, could see as at the moment, over 25 million children have been reached with SMC. And we also noted the challenges when we had to increase from less than 20 LG to 400 LG, and we noted the resource constraints. And as of now, a lot of innovations have also come into play, use of ICT4D to implement SMC. We've also seen remarkable success with the deployment of this electronic data capturing, which has made data more available and also realistic for proper planning. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Cyril. Obviously a very rich presentation and lots to digest there. I really appreciate your walking us through the decision-making process in Nigeria. In the interest of time, we'll go quickly to our final presentation, which is Yakuba Savadogo, who is a medical doctor specializing in malariology. He works specifically in Burkina Faso in varying capacities, and he's worked as a malaria specialist across the Sahel under contract with the Global Fund. I'll turn it over to you, Yakuba, to give your presentation.
Good morning, everybody. So my slides are in English, but I will be doing this presentation in French. I am doing this on behalf of the Global Fund Malaria team, and with who we have been working mostly with Susie, who is the advisor to the Global Fund for Malaria, and Muri, who is our specialist HBHI for the countries involved. Okay, so this first slide is just to say that in terms of the financing volume, SMC funding from the Global Fund has increased. At NFM1, it was about $40 million, and now it's $200 million in the current grant cycle. We're in cycle 7 now, so NFM4. I only have 3 slides, so I won't take up much of your time, but in terms of the influence and the HBHI elements, whether that's stratification, modeling, and even the future analyses, this work has had an impact on stratification and micro-stratification as well, in terms of the quality of care in the health districts. Here are a few partners: WHO with CHAI, who provides support in different countries, along with other partners as well. And there is also the retrospective analysis as well, which was performed with support from the WHO. There are a few other partners here as well, like Northwestern University, PathCHI, and Blue Square. So this work has had an impact on the funding cycles. As you know, funding cycles in the Global Fund are based on our funding ceilings. So when we've subtracted the aid from states and other partners such as PMI, the work that has an influence on the strategic plan is also involved in drawing up national plans for the elimination of malaria. And all of that prior work, stratification analysis, projections, mathematical work, but also by measuring the impact of the main interventions on malaria and microstratification. So all of this will, of course, have an impact in terms of the scenario based on the strategic plan, which is usually a national plan, but the countries do also prioritize taking into account the available resources. So domestic resources or subsidies from the Global Fund and the PMI as well, which is a significant partner for the Global Fund in supporting countries. And then there is SMC as well. I mean, I won't dwell on this because the modelers have already spoken about this at length, but we also have the numbers of cycles and age groups. All of these are elements that are relevant and can have an impact on planning in the strategic plan and have an impact on the Global Fund financing, because when we are doing this funding, we have a priority based on the willingness in the strategic plan, but also based on the resources available as well in terms of the funding that the Global Fund can actually provide. And then there is also another influence that we have for the current cycles as well, because sometimes countries do not prepare enough, even if it's from stratification or the modeling results. or from the retrospective analysis results. Sometimes that happens when the countries are reviewing their strategic plan or when they are drawing up a new strategic plan. So sometimes we have to go back and forth a little bit to balance out what we call the Global Fund performance cases and the analysis tables, because there needs to be a balance between what they want and the resources that's available. So sometimes there is a bit of toing and froing for that. So they do tend to increase costs, and CMS, for example, we have to increase the number of cycles or even reduce them, because, for example, in the Sahel countries following stratification, some countries which were at 4 cycles everywhere have gone back to 3 cycles in some places, because the stratification has demonstrated, and modeling has also demonstrated, that there was no point having 4 cycles in some places where there was no added value, having more than 3 SMC cycles, for example. This is my last slide, just to say that in terms of the current cycles, from cycle 1 and 2, or windows 1 and 2, the majority of the funding requests were based on stratification. That is one point. So it's always stratification which makes it possible to identify where you need to intervene. And for countries that have already implemented SMC, there was something about redefining microstratification geographically to see the number of cycles that were required, and also expanding it for the global fund with previous cycles. In other words, the districts or the countries that have planned to extend them, usually that is part of the pack in terms of the numbers of cycles, because the resources were insufficient. The pack is basically the financing beyond the allocated amount. So this means that it was put in that area, and there are also additional cycles as well that are required. Often these cycles are in the bar, and even though the Global Fund is flexible, this extension hasn't really been part of the country's request, especially in terms of a lack of financing. And so for the countries that are introducing SMC for the first time, because of the insufficiency of resources, SMC is very often suggested in a pilot phase for smaller geographical areas, or SMC is placed with financing beyond what was allocated because the resources are limited. Generally, TRPs, which is the technical review panel, it plays a crucial role in the adoption of global fund subsidies. TRP generally has supported country proposals for SMC, but with some suggestions, namely on the impact. Is there an impact, a positive impact? And how can modeling provide more information on that, on how to improve quality, make sure SMC is quality, and that can be provided with TRP. And it also provides the integration of SMC with other campaign interventions like malnutrition, vaccination, and others as well, because given the lack of resources, I think we could share resources with different programs and enable the SMC and other significant public health interventions to take place at the same time. TRP has also recommended an evidence-based prioritization of funding requests, which would support a very high level of possibilities to be able to conduct interventions based on evidence, given the lack of resources, because you don't necessarily want to do the same things everywhere. It's important to use evidence to put forward any recommendations on intervention, such as SMC. And for TMP, this is a very important element. This is why it's important to have stratification with the mathematical modelling and assessing the prospects to which will support our interventions, to make sure that the intervention is as efficient as possible to be implemented in the best place. So that is everything that I had to share with you today on behalf of the Global Fund Malaria team. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was very interesting.
Also, your last point is an excellent segue to our Q&A session. We have maybe looks like about 8 minutes or so, and some of our presenters are able to stay a bit longer if necessary. So we'd like to turn it over to a few of the questions. There's been a lot of questions, but using that last point of Jakuba's as a launching point, I'd like to flag the question that was addressed to Bea early on around why couldn't modeling be used to assist with the prioritization question? And along the same lines, there was another question about, could modeling help with understanding when to withdraw SMC or to switch SMC to other regions of the country and alternate new interventions into the area? So Bea, if you'd like to start off with that, and then if others would like to chime in with their thoughts, that would be welcome.
Yes, thanks, Erin. I actually just responded in the chat in case we didn't have time for the Q&A, okay. But no problem, I'll respond again. So as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the impact projections do inform prioritization as well as optimization. But when it comes to a few scenarios that countries have identified and as an additional piece of information. Now, what we don't recommend is that modeling is used on its own and solely to make decisions for various reasons. The first one is that we've seen throughout the presentations that there's still a lot of assumptions that are being done and limitations in the models per se that prevent us from ensuring or over relying on the results that come from the models. So we need to be cautious of those results. That's the first reason. The second one is that usually when it comes to prioritization, it is not only empirical evidence that we use. There's additional contextual things that countries need to consider. You've seen the example of Nigeria, where a prioritization scenario was made before modeling was introduced. So there are things that had to be considered per state, so that at the NMCP level, they decided on the few states that they wanted to prioritize out of the eligible ones that were not receiving SMC. And that was not a data-driven decision. And I think this applies to nearly all countries that are making this type of choices. Now, the third one is that really at the end of the process, NMCPs need to respond back to the MOH and their planning processes. And it is difficult for NMCPs to rely solely on models or explain to the MOH that they're using a model result to make specific decisions without having a lot of clarity of what went into these modeling outputs. So the question of ownership also comes in. However, all of that said, in nearly all countries, as you've seen, modeling has been used together with all these other criteria and all these other processes that take place. So I want to reemphasize that modeling is important, but it has a role. We can't just say that a model on its own, it's going to say or determine where things are going to happen. So hopefully that clarifies the position we have. Sorry, Erin, I forgot the second question.
Oh, it was a subset maybe of this discussion was, can you use the modeling to decide when to withdraw SMC or move SMC and switch interventions to different areas of the country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is similar. In this particular setting, you would want to remove SMC from areas where the least harm is caused, right? Now, how you define least harm without modeling first, you probably want to ensure that areas that had the highest level of severe malaria and transmission to begin with before the SMCs still receive them. And probably you want to focus on areas with a very intense seasonality, so you know the SMC is going to be very impactful, right? Of course, if the models are well calibrated, models are essentially going to arrive to a similar conclusion. But for countries, it is probably a lot better to come up with these decisions without complex models than with a complex model, even if the result is going to be similar, just because it really translates into clear ownership of the decision-making process. Now, that said, in this case, I think modeling, once these type of decisions have been made, or once this type of criteria have been decided, modeling is key to identify areas that within these parameters are still the ones that are predicted to have the worst impact if SMC is removed. So it's all about equilibrium between using all of the tools available.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'm going to summarize what I think was several questions into one and see what our panel has to say. And that is about the issue of data quality. There were a number of different questions, particularly on the presentations that looked at various countries and specificities around particular districts, et cetera, asking about the quality of the data used to make some of these determinations, whether prior implementation of SMC impacts the data that you're seeing, in that incidents may have been reduced or by prior SMC if you're using routine data. Those types of questions. And this is for any of our panelists, if anyone would like to jump in and discuss the aspects of data quality. And I can't see everybody's hands.
I'm happy to
please go ahead.
have
Yes,
a first
go
pass
ahead.
if that's helpful.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a super important point, I think, and yeah, I think we're all aware that collecting very high quality data is very difficult, and often there are challenges with the data that we have to use. And just to kind of state the obvious fact that the models face exactly the same challenges with data quality as other parts of the decision-making process. So I think the common phrase that we hear for the models is if you put kind of rubbish in, you'll get rubbish out. So the models certainly aren't there to try and kind of make amends for the challenges in the primary data, and we really do rely on those. I think sometimes it can be useful to use the models to explore where kind of gaps or missing data might be most influential. So you can use the models to help you to target where the most effective improvements in data collection, or where to focus monitoring and evaluation. But the fundamental issue is the same for the models, that we kind of we do rely on good quality data, and it's always a challenge.
Thank you. I'll move to, I know we're just past time, but there was another question that seemed to pop up in different forms in different of the questions we were looking at, and that is how to incorporate the cost of interventions. There was a lot of discussion around prioritizing interventions or determining eligibility based on a number of factors of seasonality, rainfall, endemicity, etc. But many NMCPs are sitting at their desks looking at a finite resource window and trying to determine how much they can do with the resources they have. So I wondered if any of our panelists would like to speak about putting cost into these models and being able to determine whether it's better to go with PBO bed nets in a given region or perhaps SMC, or how do you make those decisions when your resource envelope is limited? That's open to anyone. And Pete is the lucky volunteer again. Thank you.
Yeah, so the models can be used to be given some costing data and be used to estimate things like cost effectiveness. I think one of the important things I'd stress here is that that kind of model cost effectiveness is only one of very many complex layers that go into the decision-making process, and often we'll find that other factors that the models can't capture, such as kind of the operational realities and other things such as that are more important or equally as important as the kind of the cost effectiveness estimates that the models can give, but they certainly can be used to help explore those aspects. And I think there's a lot of work and potential benefits in work towards using the models to help try and look at optimal intervention mixes for different places, but again, only as kind of one layer in what is a very complex decision.
Can I add just a
Oh, yes, please. Yes, please, Cyril, go ahead.
Maybe I would use the Nigerian context. So BedNet is to be implemented everywhere in the country. So the only criteria for prioritizing the kind of BedNet that happens in a location or not will be based on results from the entomological surveillance. And again, when those results are presented and we see the kind of BedNet that's best suited for a location, and assuming resources are not available, people can also look at the cost implication of each of the BedNets before finally taking the final decision of what BedNets to bring into the country. And even if there are resource constraints, we've never had a situation where you have to forgo an intervention for the other, particularly SMC and BedNets. SMC may not be across everywhere in the country, but implementation of BedNets, it's everywhere in the country. The only difference here may be the kind of nets, which considers the kind of vector that is applicable within that environment. So usually the only time we've had to do modeling, which I had mentioned earlier, was when we needed to say, okay, how do we include those other LGs we had missed out because of costing, because of funding? How do we convince the donor to include that LG in our implementation? That was the component we had to bring in a modeling, which I rightly explained earlier. But in terms of the other implementation issue, it's usually using local data available in country to see where the implementation should happen and the kind of nets that should come into the country. I just wanted to also add that component. Over.
Thank you so much for adding your perspective, Cyril. I'm looking now at the time, and we've gone over because there are so many interesting questions. One of the things I'm seeing most in the Q&A right now is whether the recordings will be available to look at later, and also the questions, because many questions were answered in written form in the Q&A, as well as the ones that we've discussed during the recorded part. And we are working right now with the SMC Alliance and colleagues to see if we can make the recording available to people, perhaps on the SMC Alliance website. And if we're able to do that, we could include the list of questions and responses that were included, because there's a lot of rich information there as well. But at this point, we've gone almost 10 minutes over our allotted time frame. So I think it's best if we go ahead and wrap up. And we thank everyone, especially our panelists, for their very rich and interesting presentations from a variety of different perspectives. And thanks to all of the attendees for really participating and providing excellent questions to our panelists. We really appreciate your interest. In fact, so much so that I'm personally thinking we need to have a discussion within SMC Alliance whether this might be a good subject for our perhaps our annual meeting next time, or some other forum where we could engage a bit more in answering questions and discussions around the modeling. So once again, thank you to the presenters, thank you to the participants, a special thank you to the interpreters. They're always in the background, but they really help with understanding across the different countries that we're working with. Apologies if interpretation wasn't working well for you. We tried to find some workarounds, so hopefully you were able to participate. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and wrap up, and thanks again to everyone for a really rich and fascinating discussion. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Irina and Jaline. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye all.
Bye, everyone.